What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we're going over 5 players that I think will really hurt the teams that draft them. So why don't we leave them up to our league mates to take? First up, start with running back. We have Rachaad White, currently being drafted as the 13th running back off boards. When I bring up ADP in this video, it's a composite of all the major platforms. So 13th running back off the boards, being taken in the second pick in round 4. I have him graded out as like a mid-5th round pick, so I don't think he's like some terrible pick, but I'm a little over a round behind ADP. Now, I like White. I think he's a good player. My prospect model liked him. We have been very on him in the past. I think he's the best running back that the Bucs have. However, I think for where he's being drafted, it's very close to his ceiling. I do think his ceiling is still a little bit higher than where he is, but it's very close to it, and you're going to need basically like a best case scenario outcome for him to exceed value, and I don't think he can do much more than like slightly exceed value. He was second in the NFL with 336 touches last season, and he managed to score 9 touchdowns on a team that was 19th in touchdowns per game. All the other Bucs running backs combined for the entire season had 88 carries and 18 receptions. White had basically the best case scenario outcome for touches and touchdowns for what he could have possibly done last season, and yet that only resulted in him finishing 14th in points per game. And that is my issue. He sort of can't get more touches per game than he had last season. He stayed entirely healthy. You know, it's unlikely that he scores like a lot more touchdowns. Again, they weren't some like prolific offense last season. We're not expecting them to be some amazing offense this season. If anything, I think it could get worse without Dave Canales. And so why would we expect a huge spike in touchdowns? Like 9 was already pretty strong last season. And so if we're going to draft him ahead of his points per game from last season, we're going to need both of those two to remain high. He's going to have to continue being second in the NFL in touches and having a decent touchdown outcome for how good the offense is. And we're going to need an increase in efficiency. Now, I do think the efficiency could rise. He obviously has room to rise in efficiency because he was inefficient, but I think it's more likely that either that doesn't happen or that Bucky Irving just gets more touches than Chase Edmonds and Keyshawn Vaughn, or that Dave Canales leaving drops the efficiency of the entire offense, and now you would have fewer touchdowns, potentially fewer touches, and now he needs to be way more efficient, almost get to like a hyperly efficient player to outperform his ADP. And that's just a lot of risk to take on, even before considering opportunity cost. Because if you got to his spot and you were like, yeah, but like you could say that about every player there, there's no real high upside players, there's no players we really love in that range, it'd be like, fine, kind of take him as a cop out, kind of just being like, you know, default, we'll take him because we don't want anyone else there. You know, he's going ahead of. These are players you have to draft him before. James Cook, Joe Mixon, Ken Walker, Devonta Smith, Stephon Diggs, Lamar Jackson, Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, and Dalton Kincaid. Now, maybe you don't have every single player on that list ahead of Rachaad White, but I would imagine that for everyone watching this, a few of those names did stand out. And again, it's multiple positions. It's not even just saying, well, but there's great wide receivers. It's like there's great wide receivers, great quarterbacks. Like there's really strong tight ends in this range. And so the opportunity cost is massive. And so whenever we draft a player in this general, like I would say 4 through 6 range for the rounds, it's not that all of these players are going to hit. It's that we're going to get some really high ceiling outcomes. And so I want the player I'm drafting there to be super locked in and have a clear path to a league-winning season, and I just don't see that for Rachaad White. I think he has to get very lucky to have a really high-end season. I think the most likely outcome is he kind of returns value, and I think that's fine in this range, but it's not really going to help you all that much. And if he doesn't return value, I think the next most likely outcome is that he really hurts you for where you took him, because there's so many league winners that end up going in that range, especially at other positions, compounded with the fact that maybe he ends up being a slight negative because you're sitting there being like, is he averaging, 20th in points per game because Bucky Irving's taking over and the offense just simply isn't as good. Another running back that I would let others draft is James Conner, I've notoriously been out on Conner. So like for White, this is probably the first season I haven't been in on Rachaad White. I've loved him for a while now. James Conner, I've kind of been out on him in recent years, and to his credit, he's probably coming off his best season ever. It wasn't from like a fantasy points per game perspective, but like him as a player, as a running back, that was probably the best season we've seen him have. The thing is, one, he can't stay healthy. I mean, through 7 seasons, he's played more than 13 games only one time. At age 29, I'd be surprised if he made it to the season, so he's probably going to miss time with an injury. That's fine when you have, Amari Cooper and Keontae Ingram as your backups, but it's not fine when you have Trey Benson as your backup. If Conner misses a few games, which again is probably going to happen, so when Conner misses a few games this season, it's not like it's a guarantee he's going to be thrust back into like a featured workload like he was, again, when he's backed up by Amari Cooper and Keontae Ingram, right? The other concern is, okay, let's just completely throw that out. The fact that like literally if he gets hurt, he might not come back to the starting job. Even when he's not hurt, he has been inefficient in the receiving game throughout his career. But like I said before, he had scrubs behind him. So it didn't really matter. It was like, yeah, he's averaging like 6 yards per reception. He's not really like, running these insane routes and getting open at a high rate. It's more just like he's on the field a lot. He's catching these dump offs when they're behind, when they just have no one else to throw to. It's like, here's finally a dump off to James Conner. He's not commanding any sort of target share. This season, I honestly don't think when they get down, when they get into obvious passing down situations, I don't think James Conner is going to be the back that's on the field. I think it's going to be Trey Benson. And that is a really big concern because they're probably going to be down a decent amount. I mean, their defense is not very good. They're going to be in obvious passing downs a decent amount this season. I know they want to run the ball, but again, I don't really trust their defense enough to like continually keep them ahead in games. If you look at their projected wins this season, they're not expected to be some amazing team. So they're going to be losing a decent amount of time. And if Conner does lose those snaps, now the touches overall are going way down. He's not an efficient running back, so he's going to need overall a lot of the touches. But he's going to become a game script dependent running back, like an early down grinder on a team that, again, is going to be trailing more than they're winning. And if that's not enough, you consider the Cardinals have the 3rd worst playoff schedule. They have the single worst opening 5 weeks. They start the season at Buffalo versus the Rams versus the Lions. I mean, think about those 3 games, right? He's not going to do well at Buffalo. They're going to lose to the Rams. They're going to lose to... It's a divisional game, so you never know what's going to happen with the Rams game, but you would think they're probably going to be underdogs in that game. They're going to lose versus the Lions. You have a winnable game at home against the Commanders in week 4, but then it's at San Fran, at the Packers. You go through that 6-week stretch, there's going to be at least 3 or 4 games where they are losing, and if Trey Benson is getting a decent amount of touches, especially in the receiving game, his value is going to absolutely tank. And so for me, if you like James Conner, don't draft him. Just keep him in mind as a trade target because maybe he gets super lucky with touchdowns in some of these games. But again, rolling through those opponents, it's unlikely they win a lot of these games. Again, the Bills, the Rams, the Lions, the 49ers, the Packers, and then one that they'll probably be favored against the Commanders, but that's in week 4. We might get to week 4 and he might be a high-end trade target for us because maybe he only has, 13 carries for 50 or 60 yards on average his first few games, not many receptions. If he doesn't score, you're looking at a very, very bad outcome for him in fantasy. I really think he's a player that you're going to want to not draft early in the season. That's when maybe if you do like him, that's when go after him. I think there's way too much risk that he suffers an injury, that he opens the season bad, that Trey Benson's the passing down back or just takes more even on early downs than we think. Like there's so many factors that I just can't do it. Trade for him if you really want him early in the season. Moving on to wide receiver. I would let other people draft Amari Cooper. He's 30 years old now, entering his 10th season in the NFL, coming off his first season ever with over 1,200 receiving yards. The thing is, that was thanks to the one monster week 16 game. I know a lot of people hate the argument of like just removing a player's best game. It feels unfair because it did happen. I think people just look at the 1,250 yards. They think, okay, well, the Browns going to be really pass heavy this season. And it's just very easy to talk yourself into Amari Cooper, but he actually wasn't that valuable last season. If you look at like actual value in making the playoffs, right? Last year, you'd think, okay, he had a really strong season. He outperformed his ADP on a points per game basis. He actually provided a 13% decrease in playoff rate to people who drafted and kept him. Because during the actual regular season getting into the playoffs, he was 31st in fantasy points per game. So I know we see the end of season numbers, but through those first 15 weeks, 30 wide receivers on a per game basis were more valuable than Amari Cooper. And it wasn't just because of Joe Flacco late in the season. If you look at before Flacco took over in week 13, so in week 1 through 12, he was 33rd in points per game. Joe Flacco really locked into Amari Cooper. Joe Flacco was a quarterback when he had that monster, 11 reception over 200-yard multi-touchdown game in week 16. And this isn't like a new thing for Amari Cooper. It wasn't like last season was the first time this has played out. It's almost every year that he largely disappoints every week, but then he has like one, maybe two, just absolute nuke weeks. They give him a decent final points per game. And I understand that we talk a lot about, players with a high-end weekly ceiling, right? Because we want that in fantasy. We want Tyreek Hill. We want CeeDee Lamb, right? But Amari Cooper has a much lower floor than all these players. And it's I want the high weekly ceiling on the players who are also wide receiver ones. When we look at it, it's Amari Cooper through 9 years has literally never been a wide receiver one. In a per game basis, he's been 29th, 14th, 32nd, 24th, 13th, 21st, 30th, 16th, and again, 17th last season. But for most of the season, he was outside the top 30. It was just one really big game. Again, one top 15 wide receiver finish across 9 seasons in the NFL, 0 seasons as a wide receiver one. He's being billed as a ceiling play because he has a high weekly ceiling, but he's a floor play. From a season-long standpoint, Amari Cooper is a floor pick. And again, I don't want a floor pick in the early 5th round. You're taking him ahead of Malik Neighbors, Flowers, Dell, Higgins, Anthony Richardson, Dalton Kincaid. Again, maybe you don't love that entire list ahead of him, but we're in the early 5th round. That is not a range I want a floor play. Amari Cooper has shown us for 9 consecutive seasons that he is not a league winner. He's not been a league winner in any of the last 9 years. I don't think that's going to all of a sudden occur once he hits 30 years old. I just don't buy it this season. Let other people draft him. They're going to realize what people realized that they had him last year. He was fantastic in that one playoff game that he really helped to advance in. In all of the other weeks, it wasn't that amazing, right? So you can't just look at the points per game at the end of the season. You got to kind of look at it and be okay, remove the one good game. He wasn't that great overall. A year older. I don't want him. I would really let others draft him this season. 4th player I'd let your league mates draft is Trevor Lawrence. If Amari Cooper is a classic floor play, then let me introduce you to the ultimate no-ceiling king, and that is Trevor Lawrence. He has started 50 games in his career. He has thrown for 300 yards and at least 2 touchdowns. And I want to be clear, that is only 20 fantasy points, right? 300 yards, 2 touchdowns is not a very high barrier. He has done that 4 times in 50 games. He has 6 career 3 or more touchdown passing games. That's pathetic. He has thrown for at least 2 touchdowns. Not that difficult to do. Only 30% of the time. When we're drafting a quarterback this season, we need someone capable of 30 points in a given week, because with how many quarterbacks are set up extraordinarily well this season, you know that many of them are going to hit, right? There are a lot of quarterbacks that have a very high-end ceiling this season. For us to expect all of them to bust or get injured in some way, it's basically just not going to happen. We're going to have multiple quarterbacks this season that go off. In Trevor Lawrence's 50 career games, he has 3 games in his career over 25.2 fantasy points, and he scored at least 22% of the time. This season, sure, they added Brian Thomas Jr., but they lost Calvin Ridley. That's a net negative. And initial beat reports have Gabe Davis playing ahead of Brian Thomas Jr. I don't think that's going to last into the season. I think that's more of an early camp thing. But it speaks to the fact that Brian Thomas Jr. is not someone that's expected to walk in, be a true X receiver, be Calvin Ridley from last season. That's not going to happen. Calvin Ridley leaving and having Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas Jr. replace him is a net negative. So for Trevor Lawrence to like be a good pick, you're going to need a massive year 4 jump. And I just think he's really going to hurt the teams that drafted him because he's going to like do well enough to where you're never going to feel confident in dropping him because you're going to be like, well, I'm looking at free agency and everyone else is basically just as good. So I really just don't know what to do here. But he's never going to win you weeks. And so most of the time, you're going to be going up against Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Mahomes, Lamar, Richardson, Kyler, Stroud, Dak, Love. That's going to be your opponents almost every week. And so you're going to be at a huge competitive disadvantage at the quarterback position. And you're just going to be praying every single week that your quarterback that you're going up against doesn't drop 30, 35 points because that's going to be a massive differential from your team to your opponent. And it's not like you gained some huge edge, right? In like taking, round 5 or 6, like wide receiver or running back where your opponent took quarterback. You're not gaining that same sort of edge that you are waiting a couple rounds and then drafting Trevor Lawrence later. Because I would get it if Trevor Lawrence was like, an 18th round pick, but that's just not the case. He still goes relatively early in drafts because people just see the prospect that he was. Like, oh, Trevor Lawrence was supposed to be this generational prospect. He was the number 1 overall pick. He's had good seasons in the past. He's had these good games. It's like not really. Like when you look at fantasy points, he's really not done anything in his career. It's a worse situation than it was last season. And he has absolutely no upside. If you draft a quarterback this season, you need to look at it and say, what is your path to a top 5 season? If you don't have that path, I just can't draft you this season with how good quarterbacks are going to be. Final player that I would let your league mates draft is Brock Bowers. And I know that it's exciting to go after him because he's such an elite prospect. We just kind of know that he's going to be a high-end player in the NFL, but also like high-end producer in fantasy this season. And we see, last year having Sam Laporta just do such an incredible job as a rookie. It's just easy to talk yourself into Bowers, but it was an entirely different situation, right? The Lions were 2nd in the NFL in touchdowns per game, 3rd in the NFL in passing yards per game. The Raiders are probably going to be bottom 10 in both of those metrics. You've got Laporta, who was, the clear starter in week 1 last season. Bowers is probably going to start, but it's probably going to be because they run a ton of 2 tight end sets, but they're still going to have Mayer out there. Mayer's still going to, command targets. You've got the Lions with Jared Goff as their quarterback, not Aiden O'Connell, and then maybe Minshew if O'Connell starts to play poorly. And then to make matters worse, it's the ADP, right? Laporta ended up being a league winner because of how highly he finished, but then compounded with the fact that you got him at like pick 150 or 160. Bowers is already going at pick 100 and he hasn't even had camp hype yet. If there is any sort of hype out of camp, and again, pick 100 is like the early 9th round here, so you're not getting some insane discount. Any sort of camp hype, like a touchdown in the preseason, his ADP is going even higher. It's like, I know he's an elite prospect, and I know he's going to have some awesome seasons in fantasy in the future, but dude comes off the board before David Njoku, only a round after Jake Ferguson. Again, I would understand it if he was going as late as Laporta was last season, even being a worse pick than Laporta was last season when you think about how good the offense was, how good the quarterback play, how he was just on the field in week 1 as a starter. All of that stuff hit. We know that almost none of it is going to hit with Bowers, and it's like ceiling-wise, he's what, 4th in touches? Because you know for a fact they're going to feature Zamir White on the ground. You know Adams is going to out-target him, and Myers is probably going to out-target him as well. Jacoby Myers, not Michael Mayer. So he's probably going to be 4th in touches on a bottom 10 offense with bottom 10 quarterback play. But you're going to take him before Njoku, only a round after Ferguson, not that much after the super elite tier of tight end. The opportunity cost there, like he needs to be going later for it to be a worthwhile pick. I truly would just let others draft him this season. So let me know who you are avoiding in the comment section below, and let me know what you think of my picks as well. If you want to see who I'm targeting, who I'm avoiding among all positions, look at my take on every single player, see that on my website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. If you watched this far, then be sure to leave a like. And if you're new here, why not subscribe as well for more free content? I'll be back tomorrow with a running back player breakdown. But that, my friends, is the end of this one. And thanks for watching.